So, I would classify myself as a nerd, and something I've realised is that as nerds hit their mid-20s or later, we tend to pick up an extra hobby, like an extra nerd-related hobby. Some of us get into Magic the Gathering, some of us get into collecting Pokemon cards, some of us get into painting Warhammer figures, and some of us get into comics, and I think that's me. I think as time goes on, I am becoming more and more invested in comics, and so I feel like it'd be cool to make a video talking about my early beginnings in comics and getting into them over the last few years. Now, I have taken breaks. It's not like I've done this as one big thing. It's not like I've gone, I'm going to get into comics. It's more like I've dabbled here and there. I had a Marvel Unlimited subscription a few years ago, and then I didn't for a while, and now I do again. So it's not like I've got a huge amount of stuff to talk about, and I'm not going to get into spoilers either. I'm still kind of figuring out how to make content based around comics. Lately, I've really just kind of been giving updates in the weekly waypoint as to what I've been reading in comics, and maybe that is the way to continue going, but I want to make a video that's like, here's where I started, here's what me getting into comics looked like, and it's not going to be super comprehensive either. It's going to be somewhere I don't necessarily remember much of a particular series that I read, or I don't exactly remember the order of like the first comics I read, and I'm not going to do it in order. I kind of want to have a Marvel section and a DC section, but I do remember that while the DC section is in the second half of this video, my first real comics were in my early 20s. I'm 27 now, where I picked up some of the New 52 Batman stuff. But we'll get to DC later. I want to talk about Marvel first, because Marvel Unlimited has been a thing for longer in the UK than DC Universe Infinite has. In fact, I've only just started in DC Universe Infinite, so yeah, Marvel Unlimited. Obviously, I ended up on the route that every single person this side of the MCU being a thing probably did, where they watched a bunch of the Marvel Cinematic Universe and went, you know, I'd like to read some of the source material. I never read comics as a kid, and actually having read some comics now, I'm kind of convinced that comics are more for like 20, 30-year-olds than kids. I mean, I know there's comics made for kids as well, but you know what I mean. Either way, the first line of comics I really read on Marvel Unlimited was Ultimate Spider-Man, and I think that is a fucking fantastic starting point for anyone looking to get into comics, because for anyone who doesn't know, Ultimate Spider-Man is different to Amazing and Spectacular Spider-Man. It takes place in its own continuity. In the 2000s, early 2000s, late 1990s, I don't remember anymore, they launched a separate spin-off universe called the Ultimate Universe, where they reimagined the origins of a bunch of superheroes and told it more as a linear story, where you didn't have to know the last 60 years of Marvel lore. Would have been 40 back then, wouldn't it? The last 40 years of Marvel lore to really know everything that was going on. And they had reimagined versions of like the Green Goblin and Kraven the Hunter, and stuff like that. And I highly recommend it to anyone who's considering getting into comics. Go and read Ultimate Spider-Man, because I think you'll have a great time. It's not perfect. It's a little too horny for my liking, like as in like you'd be like, they are teenagers, my guy, stop sexualizing them. But other than that, it's pretty cool. And as I'm sure you may have heard, if you've heard people talk about the Ultimate Spider-Man comics before, if you are looking to get into the origins of Miles Morales' Spider-Man, this is also the place to do it. Without getting into too many spoilers before I get away from Ultimate Spider-Man, I will say it is so far the only comic to invoke a physical emotional reaction from me. Like I teared up at one point. It was really good. Really well done stuff. I did also read some Miles Morales Spider-Man. I read a 2015 Secret Wars, which is kind of what it all leads up into, the end of the Ultimate Universe. And then after that, I read Miles Morales. But because I wasn't very well versed in the kind of like mainline universe at that point, it was a little bit of culture shock for me. I did enjoy what I read of it, but I don't remember a lot of what I read, which is, in my opinion, a telltale sign that it didn't particularly resonate with me, considering I remember the stuff that came before it in Ultimate Spider-Man a lot better than I remember the Miles Morales stuff. Again, I enjoyed reading it. I remember enjoying reading it, but I think I spent a lot of time going, wait, what state is Earth even in at this point in the mainline series? I also read some Invincible Iron Man and some 4 post Jane Foster, I believe, and the Iron Man series I read was like around the same time, like 2012 onwards maybe, I'm not sure, but again, those didn't particularly stick with me all that much. I remember, as far as Iron Man goes, if you want to really nail down the time period I read, Mary Jane Watson was working for Tony Stark at that point, and then I think it led into Civil War 2, which I was not a fan of. I wasn't a fan of Civil War 1 either. Actually, I remember now, the very first comic I ever bought was Civil War. And let me tell you, that is not a good comic to start reading Marvel Comics in, because it's just got so many characters that you've never seen or heard of, and you don't know what's going on. And also, at the time, I didn't realize that the way comic events even worked is that you had the mainline event series, which you could just read, but if you wanted more information on particular characters, they had like Spider-Man Civil War and Captain America Civil War and stuff like that. I didn't know that was a thing. That was not collected in the paperback edition I read, and it just kind of felt incomplete and weird. I actually can't think of a comic event that I've really enjoyed. They've all felt kind of weird and incomplete, and an idea that has failed to be realized to its full potential. If anyone has some really good Marvel comic events or DC comic events that are just really good to read, that you really enjoyed, please let me know in the comments, because I have yet to come across one. But again, that might have more to do with context and my familiarity with characters and stuff like that. Actually, I did enjoy the recent Secret Wars, which I read recently, as part of, we'll get into this now, my Amazing Spider-Man read-through. I would not recommend doing this unless you are particularly interested in historical context of like reading a comic in the 60s and being like, wow, comics were so different back then, this portrays a different society to the one I grew up with, that kind of thing. But one of the earliest projects I took on, I can't remember if it was before Ultimate Spider-Man or after. I definitely took breaks, but I started reading the Amazing Spider-Man series from issue 1 way back in 1964? 1963, somewhere around there. And at first, I was just going to read every single Amazing Spider-Man comic issue from 1 to the present day, knowing it was a gargantuan task, but wanting to do it nonetheless. I have since, from around issue 250 or something, started using a reading guide instead, because actually it was earlier than 250, it's more like 180, because that would be insane reading all the comics, because there are large swathes of comics which just aren't that interesting, that don't advance the plot very far. So I'm gonna give a shout out, as if they need it, from my channel, to a website called comicbookreadingorders.com, which I've been using as a guide for a while now, to read Amazing Spider-Man, the original series, and it jumps through a whole batch of years, and honestly, there are some moments where I feel slightly lost, but usually the comics chosen are the ones that fill in the blanks anyway. Like at the start, they're like, wow, I can't believe this happened off screen, and you're like, okay, that happened off screen because it probably wasn't a very interesting read. But I'm up to like, Carnage has just been introduced, it's somewhere in the 300 issues, it's somewhere at the beginning of the 1990s, and it has absolutely been a good choice to go for the reading order list instead. It's still a massive undertaking as well. There's still hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of comics in that reading list of just the good ones and the important ones. So I don't feel like I've kind of lost there. If anyone is considering doing something like that for one of their favorite characters, I recommend at least looking up a reading order guide to cut out the comics that don't matter and are super dull. But I think the key to getting into comics is just accepting that you're not going to know everything. Although that being said, I did start trying to read volume 5 of Amazing Spider-Man and just jump ahead and see what modern Spider-Man is up to. And while those were good and interesting comics, I did kind of stop and continue my read through of the historical versions of Spider-Man, because the newer comics just spend so much time giving exposition about things that happened in his past that I'm like, I'd rather go and see it for myself. So there's a balance to be struck there for sure. Now I do just want to nip in here as well that I read the original Secret Wars. I knew it was where Spider-Man got his original symbiote costume from, but that was really kind of like an afterthought in the entire comic run. It was actually just quite fun to read. Now, after Carnage is introduced in Amazing Spider-Man, the reading order tells you to go and read Spider-Man 2099. I'm assuming because that's around the time that comic series released, and also because he probably meets Spider-Man later with the whole Spider-Verse stuff, which I can't wait to get to. But I'm very early, I'm like 7 or 8 issues through Spider-Man 2099 right now, and I've always been curious about that series, and I'm absolutely loving it so far. It's fascinating, it's really interesting, this dystopian cyberpunk future that it takes place in, the kind of hints to the past where they're like, oh yeah, all that ugly business at the end of the heroic era. I'm like, what ugly business? Do they ever expand on that, or would that be painting themselves into a corner lore-wise? Like, it's super interesting, and it's really fun so far. I should have mentioned this when I was talking about the other Ultimate series, but I did also read Ultimate Fantastic Four, because when you read the 2015 version of Secret Wars, you are introduced to a character that makes you go, wait, hang on, I want to go back and see that happen. So yeah, Ultimate Fantastic Four I don't remember quite as much about. but I do remember enjoying it. And yeah, go read Ultimate Fantastic Four, I guess. There are so many comics that I want to get into at some point, and I do want to try getting into Fantastic Four in the mainline series at some point, because I have really good memories of the original Fantastic Four movie, and I just like those characters, so that's something I want to do in the future. When I resubscribed to Marvel Unlimited recently, this year, one of the first things I did was go back and read Daredevil, and I did that both with the mindset of I'm not going to know everything and I don't need to know everything, and also my handy dandy comic book readingorders.com, which suggested an alternate starting point of Daredevil Volume 2. It recommends literally every single issue in Daredevil Volume 2, and I don't blame it, because Daredevil Volume 2 is a fucking banger. For anyone who has watched the TV show, I would say it's a great jumping off point. Daredevil 2 issue 1 has lots of similar lore to compare to the end of a show. There's some differences, but you're not going to feel too lost. I will also say it doesn't open in a particularly amazing way, but it does very quickly get really good. Daredevil Volume 2 does end with a Shadowland event, and as I alluded to previously with me not really enjoying any Marvel comic events so far, I kind of got halfway through Shadowland using the reading order guide to read all the, in-between bits of like Elektra's point of view and all that, and I kind of just fell off it. It's just, I don't know, man, I don't like comic events. It just, they're just, I don't gel with them. They were telling a really good linear story for so long, and then suddenly it becomes like this major event that affects every Marvel comic, and suddenly, I don't know, the scope changes and I don't care anymore. But either way, Daredevil Volume 2 is some of the most fun I've had in comics so far, so I highly recommend reading that. I almost forgot about Marvel Zombies, and Marvel Zombies I read with a friend, or at least Volume 1. No, actually, I think it was all of the volumes I read with a friend. I streamed my screen and read it on web, and we read through Marvel Zombies together, and it was a fantastic time, but sadly, the second, third, and I think maybe fourth Marvel Zombies volumes do not quite live up to the first one. But Marvel Zombies is a really fun what if kind of thing of like, what if there were zombies in the Marvel universe and they took over all of the heroes, and how would that world look? There was an actual Marvel Zombies what if episode in the What If series on Disney Plus, but I don't really think that did it much justice either. I know people enjoyed it, but I still think the original Marvel Zombies is much more fun, so go check that out. And finally, in its own little mini section here, because they are Marvel comics these days, the service also has some Star Wars comics, and I read through Darth Vader, although I'm not going to be able to distinguish which Darth Vader because there's a few different issue ones floating around out there, but I did buy the physical comic of this one. It's the one where Dr. Aphra is introduced, and it's got some really fun stuff there. There was also a concurrent series just called Star Wars, which takes place, I think it's between episode 4 and 5, and it's some miscellaneous adventures of Luke, Leia, and Han Solo, and that was pretty fun to read too, though not quite as fun as Darth Vader in my opinion. I also recently started reading the High Republic series because I've not gotten into High Republic era Star Wars yet. It's still very new, and that was okay, but it did kind of fall off for me fairly quickly. It felt like it was trying to take on too many new ideas in too short of a time, and that does it. That's all the Star Wars I've read so far. That's it for Marvel Comics, would you believe? That both feels like simultaneously quite a lot and not a lot at all. I'll spend some time talking about what I want to read in the future regarding Marvel Comics. I'll try to be specific and not just say everything, because let's be honest, everything. As I mentioned earlier, I'm very curious to see what some of the Fantastic Four comics are like. I'm not going to do the whole read every single issue like I tried with Amazing Spider-Man, but I am curious about some of the super early stuff. But mostly, some of the more recent stuff. I know it got discontinued in like 2017 and then brought back recently, something like that, so that'll be interesting to see why that happened. I assume just because they didn't have the ability to make Fantastic Four characters in their MCU and didn't particularly want to give free press to Sony. I don't know, that's a theory I've seen around. Having seen the origin of Venom recently in the Amazing Spider-Man, I know Venom gets his own series at some point. I'm kind of interested to read that. I want to read some Guardians of the Galaxy stuff as well. I really like the sci-fi that Marvel does with Guardians of the Galaxy. It's just the right flavor for me, so want to hop on board that, especially like in the modern comics era with like the digital art that people do now. That would look really good. Actually, I think the first ever comic I read on Marvel Unlimited during my free trial was a Guardians of the Galaxy one. That's just a latent memory which resurfaced. You will notice there is a fairly sizable X-Men sized hole in this entire section. I've never been able to get into the X-Men. I did try reading House of M recently. Again, that's a Marvel event, and also probably not a good starting place for X-Men, so I don't know why I did that. Do not start with House of M. But I follow someone who's a massive X-Men fan, and I'm just like, I should probably try and get into them at some point. They just don't really appeal to me. Also, my friend's a massive X-Men fan, so I feel like I owe it to them to try and read X-Men at some point. If anyone knows a good starting point, let me know. And my final throwing out suggestion here of what I want to read, outside of just the vague everything, is 4. I want to get into a good 4 run, and I've heard good things about like 2011 onwards, so maybe I'll do that. 4. Everyone makes fun of me because I can't say 4. And by everyone, I mean my parents. My parents make fun of me. It's a very toxic relationship. DC time! Some of the first comics I ever bought were the New 52 Batman series, and I know that people have very varying opinions about the New 52 line. I know a bit more about the general DC lore now. I know this is basically like the 4th era and like the 2nd reboot, but I was the young, late teens, early 20s person that the New 52 branding appealed to, where it's like, do you have no idea where to start in comics? Don't worry, we've just killed all of our lore and rebooted our universe, start here. And I was like, yeah, that sounds good, I'll do that. I like a bit of Batman. I have not read all of the New 52's Batman, but I have read most of it. Off the top of my head, I've read the Court of Owls stuff, I've read the 0 Year stuff, I've read the Joker stuff, what's it called, Death of the Family, I think I've read a couple other storylines in there as well, but I can't remember them off the top of my head. And I've read what's pretty much the end with Super Heavy. Some of these I own as New 52 trade paperbacks, that's the way you say that. And another way I own them is what I'm going to talk about next, which is a company called Eagle Moss did a collection called The Legacy of Batman, which is, you would subscribe to it for, I believe, £20 a month, and every month they would send you 2 hardcover paperbacks. I mean, it is a bit like that. They're very cheap hardcovers. They're basically just paperbacks of what they declared to be some of Batman's most important stories, and they had a kind of volume numbering system. They would send them to you out of order, obviously, to try and bait you into staying subscribed the entire time. Yes, it worked with me, and I've got to be honest, I regret doing this. I did this back when I first got a job and when I had like income for the first time, and I was like, you know what, I can spare £20 a month for some Batman comics, but I very quickly fell off reading them as they came in the post, and therefore I just have probably 30 or 40 behind me unopened, still in their original sealing. And now with services like DC Universe Infinite, it just kind of feels like it was a waste of money to get those. People might say, no, it's not a waste of money because you own a physical edition of that comic, and you know, physical's better to read and you actually own it instead of having to rent it from a digital source. But you know, I do Game Pass, I do Marvel Unlimited, I do DC Infinite Universe DC Universe Infinite now. I'm okay with that model, so I might look into selling those off at some point. Especially since the way Eagle Moss did it, they were like, oh, you get to read a curated timeline of Batman, and I'm like, well, I know that that's going to take place over multiple different eras in multiple different continuities, so it's kind of made up. their timeline's kind of made up, and I don't like that. But yeah, due to this, I have read some pre-New 52 Batman stories as well, but out of order and with lots of gaps. I know about Damian Wayne. I know some stuff like that. A lot of it's left in my head already. So for a while there, when I got DC Universe Infinite literally 5 days ago, I was like, maybe I'll do a similar thing that I'm doing with Spider-Man and try and read it from the very beginning with a reading order. I did read the very first appearance of Batman, and I read like the very first story of Batman and the Joker and stuff like that, but I very quickly decided, no, I'm not going to do that. So what I did instead is I jumped forward to Crisis on Infinite Earths to give myself some context for how that original era ends and how the second era begins. But after finishing that, I actually just went ahead and decided to start reading some of the stuff. Well, first I went and watched a video recommending a bunch of what to read, and they recommended Justice League New 52, and I was like, I know I love the New 52 style. I guess there's not a quote-unquote New 52 style, but I know I love modern comics, and I know I had a lot of fun with Batman in New 52, so yeah, New 52 Justice League, and I literally read like maybe the first 8 issues of that last night, and I'm having a great time with it so far. So that's like my most recent comic reading ventures, but there's more DC to talk about. Before I get too far away from what I just said, it was just last night that I wrapped up reading Crisis on Infinite Earths, another story that I would not recommend reading if you're not already familiar with a bunch of the characters in the DC universe. I did find myself lost at many times. However, I did know it was going to be a bit of a trial by fire, so I was expecting that, and I'm fine with it. It was a fun read, it was interesting. Again, I think I lost a bit of enjoyment from not knowing a lot of the characters that were in the panels, a lot of the intricacies of the relationships and stuff like that, but it was fun to see how the original multiverse came about and how it ended. It was a nice bit of lore to take in. It was a little bit long-winded in my opinion at 12 issues, but again, that might just be because I wasn't that familiar with the characters. My friend once lent me his first volume of Injustice, and that absolutely gripped me. I loved the living hell out of it, and I'm going to read it again and its subsequent follow-ups on DC Universe very soon. I've got to be honest, one of the things that appeals most to me about the DC Universe is the way they handle their multiverse and the way they have entire series taking place there. Like, I know about the Batman Who Laughs. Before I get away from Batman as well, one last thing, the first comic I checked out on a DC Universe subscription is, I believe it's called the Batman Adventures Mad Love, and it's the people who did the Batman animated series. They did a story about the origins of Harley Quinn, and also just a really fun story regarding her and Batman and Joker and how it all works. And I noticed there's actually a series of the Batman adventures that writer and artist did, so I might check that out at some point too. I have also read The Dark Knight Returns, and I think that's a fucking fantastic piece of comic book. I have some very interesting contextual personal memories attached to that one as well. Some years ago I did also pick up the trade paperbacks for the first 2 volumes of the New 52 Flash and the first 4 volumes of the New 52 Superman. I thought they were fun, thought they were alright. Actually, I remember being a little bit disappointed by the Flash, because the only real exposure I've had to the Flash is the CW series. Only like the first 2 series, but I really enjoyed them. I've heard it went downhill from there, by the way. So yeah, I was like, yeah, I like the Flash. I'll buy some Flash comics, and yeah, they didn't really do it for me. But as far as DC comics that I've read, that about does it. I really have not read much yet. I've only just got my DC Universe subscription. I do plan on reading a lot more. So the the section where I'm going to talk about kind of series I want to read here is going to be a bit longer for DC because I haven't read as many. I've heard that the New 52 version of Batgirl is really worth getting into, and as someone who grew up not on Batman the animated series but on the Batman animated show that came after it, which featured a lot of Batgirl, I'm excited to give it a try. In a similar vein to childhood animated cartoons, I really want to see what a good Teen Titans run looks like. I'm sure there are some good runs of The Flash out there, so I want to read a good run of The Flash. There are so many Batman storylines that I've yet to read that I want to read, like Under the Red Hood and The Killing Joke, maybe in the reverse order. There are some DC characters I know very little about that I would like to know more about, so I want to read up on Green Lantern and see what that dude's all about. I've seen some of him in Justice League now. He's very glowy, he's very green, and he's a sarcastic bastard. But other than that, I still don't know much about him. I would say that his powers feel a bit MacGuffin-y, but then that seems like a DC Comics thing in general. And also, I know people always argue that Superman is overrated. I think it's actually to the point where he might be a bit underrated. I really enjoyed the Man of Steel movie. I feel like you can do Superman right, and I'm sure somebody has. Oh, and I want to read a good Wonder Woman too. Basically, I've just barely touched DC, and I'm excited to see what it's got for me. And I think that's it. I think I'm going to end this video here before it becomes a complete rambling mess. And I'm probably going to go and read some more comics before work in the meantime. So thank you very much for listening. Please let me know down below if you've got any comic book recommendations for me, or if I've sparked your interest in any comic books that I've mentioned. I'm going to see if I can do some sort of comic book style content. I don't necessarily want to do a thoughts on for every volume of comics I read, because I blast through them so quick that would very quickly turn into a chore. So maybe just the occasional checking in and saying, this particular line of comics I just read was really good and I want to talk about it, like the entirety of Daredevil Volume 2, for instance. That kind of level of video. So thank you for listening. Leave a like if you liked the video, subscribe for more, and I'll see you next time.